This tutorial is for Lady Magenta. This is an alcohol ink piece on the matte side of photo quality paper, very similar to my tutorial for Green Queen. Some people just like to watch these tutorials, and I thought I'd change it up a little bit so you don't have to watch the same one over and over, but you do get an opportunity to see a different piece evolve from the same technique. So I am again using that's the shiny side. I'm using the matte side or the flat side of this photo quality paper. This one that I use is the Kirkland brand from Costco, and I like it because the matte side doesn't have any printing on it, which is important when you're using that to create your art. So I've cut it into quarters, that big sheet. I have adhered this one down on my Lazy Susan, which is covered in press and seal to make it easy to clean up. I put a couple loops of that Scotch tape with the sticky side out on the glossy side and adhered it to that Lazy Susan. So out comes isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol. I use a 91% solution, and I've poured some into this little quilling bottle. It's used for quilling glue, and there's going to be a drop of ink on there, which will just come off with a wipe, but I apologize, I didn't clean up entirely from my last video. My Pinata Black is a Mantilla Black, and the Senorita Magenta is the color I'm using for the petals today, and that was a Blanco Blanco or white, which I'll be using with this dotting tool and just a piece of packaging, plastic packaging for my palette. The dotting tool I'm using has two different colored, rather sized ends on it. I have several dotting tools. I just sort of pick one out of the bunch. Not too big and it's not too small. There's the blowing, or the airbrush, which I use to blow the ink around. There's no ink in the chamber. I'm just using the air, and I've got some paper towel handy, just because the ink can be a bit messy. So I'm starting with the Senorita Magenta, and I guess the lid was a little tight on there, which is a good thing, because it does evaporate. And so I've got the nozzle right down on the paper. I'm laying down what will be the center of the flower in roughly a circular piece shape. It doesn't really have to be. You just want to get the general idea. And, I will say over and over again, this is entirely up to you how you want this flower to look. If you want it to be, very particular with the petals shaped in a very certain way, you can practice doing that. I'm sure you will get the hang of it and you will make perfect petals and perfectly spaced. My flowers and my work tends to be fairly organic, not particular at all, and so I'm not too worried that that centerpiece is misshapen at all. It just, to me, lends itself to a more organic look. And what I'm doing is holding the trigger down on my airbrush. If you're using a straw, you could be blowing at this dot of ink that's laid down. The whole idea here is just to get that ink to dry, and alcohol ink dries quickly anyway, but when you've laid it down as kind of a big dollop like this, it takes a couple of minutes to dry it thoroughly. And I'll be laying down some of the Mantilla Black, and that's going to create some of the shadowing and some of the lines that give these pieces some real interest and beauty. And of course, you don't have to use black. You can just use a darker color that you choose to have as an accent color or shadow color against what would be your highlight or petal colors. And you certainly don't have to just use one color. Like I could add to the magenta a yellow, or I could add a purple or a blue, and recognizing, of course, is that colors mix as well. And you can get some amazing combinations. But whether you want to have some contrast so that you create some shadows and some light in the process. So I'm going around the sort of outside of this dollop of ink in an effort to dry it off with the airbrush. And again, although it dries very quickly, I've laid down a few drops there, so it just takes a couple of minutes to dry it right out. And then I simply go back in with my rubbing alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, lay down a bit, watch it lift the ink a bit, and then go in with the airbrush. That wasn't my best move, that first one, but I've said in other videos, and I'll say it again, that every ink behaves differently, and it behaves differently with alcohol than it will with a blending solution. And even if it's the same brand, different colors will behave differently. And so I typically go in a little bit more conservatively than what I just did with that first blow with the airbrush. But it gave me a really good idea of how this magenta ink moves, and it moves really, really well, and it tends to want to go off in long kind of spindles, and I could probably improve on that if I practiced and got a better handle on the airflow. And by the way, my compressor unit is at 20 dpi, or sorry, not 20 dpi, 20 pounds per square inch psi. DPI is to do with pictures, but anyway, that is the pressure. It's about the same pressure as you would blow in a straw. And so you can play with those pressures. If you happen to have an airbrush, you know that you can play with the compressor unit and change how much air pressure is coming out that hose and out the airbrush. And that will change the shape of the petals, or the shapes that you're creating in whatever work you're doing. So in this case, I'm entering now into the blacker area where I've dropped the ink, the black ink, sort of down next to that magenta. And again, sort of going in now and being a little bit more careful, but I'm just watching to see how the ink is behaving. And I'm not getting too concerned about it at this stage because it's very early in the game. I'm going to be covering what's here with other petals. If that wasn't the idea for you and you wanted just to get one single layer of petals, that will take some practice. And that's what I would recommend that you do, is play around with some practice sheets and get a feel for how the ink goes down. The size of the droplets that are put down is going to make a big difference as well in terms of the size of the petals, which is what we're referring to at this moment. And so I've put down a couple of drops. I wait for a couple of moments just to watch that ink underneath the alcohol get reactivated and see what colors get pulled up. It's hard to see from this vantage point, but when you're actually sitting fairly close to the piece, you can tell. So I'm getting a little bit of width. And again, I'm not really too concerned. I am not looking for a particular outcome. In most of the work that I do, I pretty much allow the ink to do what it's going to do, and I try to work with it. And so I don't anticipate an outcome that can be very disappointing. Sometimes it's very rewarding. Sometimes you anticipate something and it works out very well. That happens mostly where you're very familiar with the inks and again, how your hand moves and how the air moves and how much pressure and so on. And you can achieve the result that you're really looking for. So at this stage, I'm realizing that I'm going to gain the most by creating some contrasts in the colors and by getting some transparency. In other words, blowing sort of one layer of petals over top of another one because I can see them. And it'll give it beautiful depth by the time that I'm done. So I won't say I've resigned myself to that, but I'm aware that these petals are going to be long and very stringy. It almost reminds me of the blown glass arrangements that I've seen, and I can't right offhand remember the names of some of the artists that do it, but so long, very spindly, glass looking, so they're a bit transparent, almost translucent. And so I've decided to, as I said before, to go with it. And I will create a very wild looking, fun looking, exploding type of flower. So the other great thing about doing this is that you begin to see some, just when you think all of the ink is gone and all of the pigment is gone, you blow some of the color out and it forms just another gorgeous color. And out comes more of your, highlight color, which in this case is the magenta. But as you can see, it's gone off into a real sort of lilac purple, and then we get into the dusty kind of purples as it starts melding with the black. And if you really like this type of look, as I do, then this is really a very enjoyable, rewarding part of the process as these colors start to evolve. And so what I'm also looking at as I am going through this process and moving that Lazy Susan around are there places where I want there to be more filled in, and I like negative space and I like it to be organic looking, so I try not to make it look, for my taste anyway, to make it look like it's too precise or too predetermined. I like it looking kind of random. So the other thing I want to point out, which I have pointed out in other videos and at the risk of repeating myself, is that there are streaks along the edge of the card, and that's just where there's been too much ink for the page, and so the streaks have to run somewhere. I could try to run them right off the page, and that sometimes works, but I risk the shape when I do that. So I let them run down the edge because most of the time I'm going to be cropping off 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch from all the sides of the card anyway, and that funny little edge of ink that's been running along the side will come off once the crop is done. You can also take a Q-tip or paper towel or a piece of cloth, for example, with a little bit of the rubbing alcohol on it, and you can remove little bits of where the ink is quite light. So in other words, the petal parts. The center is going to be stained, so you can't remove it easily. But you certainly can clean up little bits and pieces that you don't really like, little stragglers at the very end. I've just shown you, by the way, the palette, the dotting tool, and that Blanco Blanco, which is the white Jacquard Pinata ink. And I've stopped at this point. I've decided that's enough petal activity. And what I've done is put a few drops into my palette of the white Blanco Blanco. And I'm going to speed this up in a couple of moments, but I want to start showing you this dotting method, which really is to dot the white on top of that center area. And you'll see that I'm not just dotting it where it's black, I'm also dotting it where it's pink and kind of red toned as well. It will, meaning the white ink, will get immersed to a certain degree into the ink underneath it, at least initially. And so where it's black, it's going to turn it a bit of gray and different shades of gray and black. And where it's pink and red, it's going to pull out the pink and red a bit more. And so you can see as I go along, and I'm just layering and layering and layering the dots. It's almost a meditational process is all I can say. It does take a while, but it's very rewarding because it's moving and changing as you're applying that white ink. So I quite enjoy it personally. I like doing these centers. You get some really interesting shapes and so on out of it. I did pick up the airbrush there and dry it a bit because the ink had been a bit sticky. The white was mostly immersed, and then by drying it a bit more, it allows the white to sit on top a bit more than what it was. And so I've determined where the shadows would be on this flower, not in an exacting way, but generally where the light is coming from. And I'll add more white to that lighter area than I will to the darker. There's still some white on the darker, but just not as much. And you can also use a white gel pen or any other type of pen, gel pen that you want. It doesn't have to be white, but that tends to be my preference, especially if I've got all these variations of the underlying colors, the black and the magenta coming through in that center area. It just makes it look quite natural. Or maybe not, maybe it looks very unnatural, but to me it suits and it gives it a lot of dimension with the white and then the various colors mixed underneath. So at this point I'm just going to give it another going over with the airbrush and give it a swing around on the Lazy Susan, and I've decided that with a little bit of reflection from the light is a wrap. And so I'll leave you with a couple of moments to just look very close up at the Lady Magenta flower, and thanks so much for joining me.